Okay, this video is going to cover the production function and the Solow growth model. So how we use the production function in the Solow growth model to think about how the society is going to get to a level of capital, and then how we can also think about growth occurring in this model. So uh, a production function is, we can represent it mathematically, but the way to think about it is conceptually. It's just a shorthand way to think about how it is that different factors of production are related to or allow the production of goods and services. And in macroeconomics here in chapters 11 and 12, and then through the rest of the book, we're going to be using an aggregate output, idea of an aggregate output. So really going to create a variable y that we'll refer to throughout the rest of the class. And y is just going to be, in effect, real GDP. So it's aggregate goods and services. And so what we're talking about here is like, what's the economy's ability to produce goods and services? And we don't really care about whether we're going to be producing apples or automobiles or cars or clothes. We're going to think about what's the overall level of production. So we'll call this Y, and say that this is just like output in the economy. And a production function, and you could represent this mathematically. What we're doing here is simply using the sort of the notation of a production function. But if you could model this, you could write this down mathematically with variables to represent the amounts of capital and labor and natural resources, which are the three we're thinking about here, and actual variables to represent the levels of those different factors of production. And then you could have a mathematical function that could relate these variables to our dependent variable, or the variable we're getting out, which is output. Another way to think about a production function is sort of like recipes for producing, think of recipes for producing food. And the recipes have a list of ingredients, and it says you have to have all these different ingredients. And one way to think about that is saying that if you have all of these ingredients, then you get a given quantity of output, a given quantity of cookies, or barbecue sandwiches, or whatever you're producing there. So a recipe is again a very simple type of production function. And so the production function, what it's doing is showing us all of the different recipes we could use, all the different ways we could combine capital and labor and natural resources to produce output. And we're using these really short labels or shorthand. There are actually obviously a lot of different types of capital. There's lots of different types of labor, and there's lots of different natural resources. So if anything, these are categories of resources. So we're going to simplify things a lot, and we're going to simply focus on the relationship between output and capital. And what we're going to do is we'll hold labor and natural resources constant in the economy. Now, in one sense, holding labor constant makes some sense, because suppose we're looking at a given economy at a given point in time. We've got a fixed number of people in that economy, so that's going to hold the labor constant, and then we'll just hold natural resources constant as well. And so we're going to focus on how does using more capital allow us to produce more output. That's really sort of the heart of the Solow growth model, to show how capital relates to output, and thus determine the level of capital that you'll have in an economy. And we'll assume that capital can be measured by one simple unit here. So we'll have quantity or units of capital. Again, this is a big simplification. There's lots of different types of capital. We'll just reduce it down to saying, units of capital. Now, the thing that's going to be important for the production function, and when we draw a graph here, is the idea of the marginal product of capital. And this is defined in the book, but the definition here would be, it's the increase in output that you get when you use one more unit of capital, holding the other factors of production constant. So what's the relationship between using capital and producing output? And to make that sense, we'll hold constant the other two. So, and what I said before is that we're going to hold labor constant, we're going to hold resources constant. That allows us to get into the case where the output that we get, the increase in output is going to be due to using more capital. So it's going to really be the marginal product of capital that's relevant here. Another thing that's nice is when we hold labor constant and we have more output. If we have more output and we're holding the number of people in our economy or in our model here constant, then we must have more output per person, because we really said that the standards of living come down to real GDP per capita. So that real GDP, or the amount of goods and services that we have, is our variable that we're getting out here. And if we hold labor constant, then if we have more goods, we have more goods per person. So we do have a higher standard of living. Okay, so now we have to draw. What we're going to do is we're going to draw a curve that would show the relationship between output and capital. And the curve is going to look like this. It's going to be positively sloped. It's going to be positively sloped, but then its slope is going to be becoming flatter. Now, the slope of this curve is exactly the marginal product of capital, because if you think about increasing capital 1 unit here, and then we get the increase in output because we're holding labor and natural resources constant. The one thing we're varying here is capital. So as you increase capital by 1 unit here on the x-axis, you get an increase in output on the y-axis. So the increase in output's on the y-axis. And if you think about this definition of what the marginal product of capital is, it's exactly that. It's the increase in output, that's the change in y, that you get when you use 1 more unit of capital. So the other thing would be the change in capital, delta K. Capital is the variable on the x-axis. So that's exactly the slope of a curve. The slope of a curve is the rise over the run, the amount of increase you get on the variable on the y-axis divided by the change in the variable on the x-axis. So the marginal product of capital is exactly the slope of this production function as we've drawn it here. Now we draw it with a positive slope. The positive slope means that when you use more capital, output goes up. And so a positive slope certainly makes sense here. We wouldn't, if we're using a scarce resource, we're only going to use capital if it allows us to produce more output. So the positive slope makes sense. And then we've also drawn it here, so it's a positive but getting flatter. So that means that the slope is getting flatter. That means that the marginal product of capital is getting smaller. And we draw that for a reason here as well. And that's the idea of diminishing returns. The idea of diminishing returns would be that as you use more of a factor of production, holding the other factors of production constant, the marginal product of that factor will decline. Now, since we're holding all the other factors of production constant except capital, and when we draw this graph here, then the conditions for diminishing returns apply. And we say, if anything, there's this thing that we call the law of diminishing returns, which again is based on other laws in economics. It means it's an empirical regularity. And so we observe this frequently, and that's what we really sort of believe we see here. So that the world we live in exhibits diminishing returns. And in the book, they have an example of, suppose you're like Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway, and you're trying to get coconuts off of trees on a deserted island. If you have a ladder, that ladder would be a type of capital. Capital is any produced factor of production. The ladder is a unit of capital, and if you have a ladder, that allows you to get a lot more coconuts than if you have to try to climb the tree yourself. Okay, so a unit of capital will be productive. Now the question would be, well, what happens when you have a second ladder? Well, if you have a second ladder, that does help you be more productive. Suppose there are coconut trees at different places around this island. Maybe some of they're separated by a decent amount of space. If you had one ladder, you'd have to carry it back and forth, and that would take time and effort. And so having two different ladders, one that you could put at each of the different stands of coconut or coconut groves on the island, would make you more productive. Now think about having an extra ladder. Well, as you add more and more ladders, they could be productive, but the amount of extra coconuts you're going to be able to get from having an extra ladder should go down. At some point, you'll have a ladder, for instance, on each and every tree. And then beyond that, to have another ladder, once you have a ladder up against each and every tree, when you think like, well, how much more is going to having an extra ladder going to give you? How many more coconuts are you going to get from having an extra ladder? Once you have one ladder leaning up against every coconut tree on the island, probably not much at all. And so what we're assuming here is that the extra output you get as you use more and more units of capital is declining. And again, that's holding other things constant. If you have more labor, more natural resources, then we wouldn't necessarily expect to see diminishing returns. But we really, by calling that a law of diminishing returns, then what we're really assuming is that we really expect to see that hold in the world. And again, for that story we just told, with ladders and coconuts, that hopefully makes it plausible. Now, the marginal product of capital is going to tell us really how much it's worth to invest and save in this economy. Because when we save, then we have some money available for investment, and then the investment is really buying units of capital to have to use in the future. So the marginal product of capital is going to tell us the return, or how valuable extra units of capital or extra amounts of investment in this economy happen to be. Okay, so suppose that we end up having a growth, that we end up having better technology. Better technology is going to shift the production function. And one of the things we can show how that would happen here in the graph. If we had better technology, what we would do is we'd be able to, in effect, produce more output from a given amount of capital. And so that would shift the production function up like this. New technology is going to shift the production function up. And if you're good with graphs, you see this too. At any given point, when we shift this curve up like this, the slope at any given point is going to be a little bit higher. So new technology not only allows us to get more output from capital, it's going to make each unit of capital that we could possibly invest in a little bit more rewarding, or a little bit more productive than it would have been before. So the slope is a little bit higher. That means, again, the returns from having one more unit of capital would be higher once we have this new technology than we did before. So when we talk about trying to make technological change in the Solow model to bring it into the model, either exogenously or endogenously, the new technology is shifting this production function up. So this is the basics of production, and how that relates to the marginal product of capital, and this sort of forms the basis of the Solow model.